So that session was an amazing one, an amazing act to follow. And we're going to try to follow it by going in a very, very different style of presentations. But I wanted to mention, since something that came up at the end about maintaining hope in seemingly hopeless situations, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot. It's actually the main focus of a project I'm doing on Hong Kong and Burma and other places, that at times I'm wondering how people stay with struggles over time that seem to have hit impossible blocks. And I think about Uyghurs, I think about Tibetans, I think about Kashmiris, I think about all kinds of people in these situations that seem utterly hopeless. And I'm, inspired by people who keep fighting for what seem like hopeless causes. And there are two quotes by two of my favorite writers that I keep coming back to that judge these two kinds of ways of both hope and hopelessness. One is Margaret Atwood was asked what she thought of the idea, Martin Luther King's idea, that the arc of the universe bends toward justice. She says that is an absolutely beautiful sentiment and it's not true. But the other is Ursula Le Guin, who talks about, she has on the one side, she said it's become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But her other was that if power seems inescapable, so did once the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. So I think one of the things is to balance those kinds of two things. But I actually hadn't planned to begin by that. I planned to begin by saying that we talked about identity. My identity is a Californian, actually. And one thing that Californians get picked on is that we like to talk far too much about the weather. And I am really glad, and Amy, who's not a Californian, and I, when we invite people, we talk a lot about the weather. We say, come on, do you want to come? If you're wondering why such an amazing set of people were on the stage right here, some of them are local, that's one reason. But others were like, we said, we've got this idea for a conference, would you consider coming out here? It'll be in February. And that's a good thing to say to people in, Chicago or New York or London, it has certain value. But I was determined I was not going to talk about the weather, but we really can't avoid starting a session on China, Russia, and the United States without talking about the weather balloon. So we had a different way of beginning, but I really think we need to begin with talking about this balloon, our allegedly weather balloon, surveillance balloon. And actually this will segue, we'll start by talking about that because it is something about the US, China, two of the places. It also will segue into, in fact, the session after lunch will be about places that are caught between or pinned between empires. And after the weather balloon, there was just an airborne something shot down over Alaska, which was one of the places that was on the agenda for a place caught between empires. So we had the prescience to make sure that we had a specialist in Alaska coming who will be on the next session. I wish I could say we were prescient enough to have a balloon specialist here, but we almost do. So we do not have a balloon specialist, but we do have somebody who has worked on US and China, reported on both places, and has written spy novels. So we don't have a balloon specialist, but we have a surveillance specialist. But I want to just mention who the panelists are before we begin going that way and then talking about the other things that we were going to bring up. So first will be Adam Brookes, who, and I'll just mention, I love the names of the books of the most recent books of the panelists. Adam's most recent book is called Fragile Cargo. I think it's a lovely title, and it's about what happened to the treasures of the Forbidden City during World War II. Katie Stallard, next to him is was a reporter for Sky News and now writes for the New Statesman, but I'll just mention her book title, Dancing on Bones. It's about the way in which the Chinese government, the Russian government, and the North Korean government use stories about history to legitimate their rule. And stories that have to do with imperialism, if not necessarily with empire, are key to all of those legitimations or fighting imperialism. Next to her is Will Dobson, who has another title that I love, The Dictator's Learning Curve, which I think it's one of the, for me, it's one of the most important books that was published in the 2010s, and I think it's ridiculously underappreciated. I thought it was a book that did what I thought political scientists should do, but had largely stopped doing. It looked at patterns in what we now think of like this field of strongman studies, only that strongmen of different ideologies seem to be borrowing worse tactics worse models from each other. And he was doing that at a time when it was Russia, China, and Brazil was what was the third? No, sorry. Venezuela, sorry.
Malaysia.
And I had one major critique of the book. It was called The Dictator's Learning Curve. It was about charismatic leaders in these three places that didn't have the same ideology, but there was strongman rule. And I had a serious critique of it, much as I loved it, which was that he was wrong about China because it didn't have this is time of Hu Jintao, who was like zero charisma in terms of Dungeons and Dragons. But the one flaw, then history took care of, because now China has a personality cult leader and all of that out there. And then last but not least, my colleague Judy Wu of the Asian American Studies Department and History Department here, and an associate dean who I never mind seeing even at 7 or 8 in the morning. Judy's most recent book, it's great, Fierce and Fearless, was about, and it focuses on another classic place between imperial projects and empires, Hawaii. So, but I first heard Judy speak when she was speaking about, we want everybody to be a twofer here. Everybody has worked on 2 of the 3 places in one way or another. The first time I ever heard Judy give a talk was a great talk about a delegation of Black Panthers who went to Beijing at a time when there were no relations between countries. So we have a panel where each of them has dealt with 2 of the 3 superpowers. So without further ado, Adam, who before writing Fragile Cargo wrote a trilogy of spy novels, can you talk a little bit about sort of how to think about what's going on? And I know you covered the spy plane incident of 2001, maybe a precursor to this. What do you see, what should we be thinking about with these things?
Okay, the balloon. The balloon moves slowly, right? And it can linger. And it doesn't move quickly in a straight line. US air defenses are all set up to intercept things that move really fast in straight lines, missiles, fighter aircraft. Balloons don't do that. They linger, and they can stop over a certain place and take photographs and suck up signals and do all sorts of very useful intelligence gathering stuff. The balloon that the Americans shot down, we sort of know what was on it, but you can imagine that it was, this is caveat emptor, I don't know any of this stuff, there's just ways of thinking about it. A balloon like that might, for example, up there at 65, 70,000 feet, that's an important piece of strategic real estate, right? You're right up at the top of US airspace before it tops out into outer space and low Earth orbit. What sort of air defense mechanisms does the US have operating up there? What radar turns on when an object comes into US airspace at 80,000 feet? What radars start finding it and looking for it? That's the sort of thing that balloon might have been there to figure out. It may have been taking photographs of the ground too, all that sort of stuff. So yes, balloons have uses for intelligence gathering. But in historical context, in World War II, the Japanese launched 9,000 balloons against the continental United States. They were loaded with incendiary bombs. Late 1944, this huge project got underway. They fired them off from Japan. They came the whole way over the Pacific. They came down, and they landed all over the western United States. It was proof of concept that you can use balloons as an intercontinental aerial weapons platform. Yeah, they work. You can do that. But you can only do them in one direction, right? Because that's the way the wind blows. So you can do them from Japan to America, but you can't do them from America back to Japan. The incendiaries were not great. They didn't work. The equipment failed. They were supposed to set the western United States on fire. A lot of them came down in Washington State in British Columbia, where it was really wet. So they didn't, the fires didn't start. It wasn't a great success, except for the proof of concept that you can use balloons as a weapons platform. The British also used thousands of balloons against the Germans in an attempt to short out power lines in Germany. So there's form here. Very briefly, one other just quick thought. The United States carries out very, very aggressive, close-in surveillance and reconnaissance on China, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, year after year after year after year. Spy planes lingering up and down the coast, hydrographic research ships that are actually spy ships, submarines investigating undersea cables, satellites, and, again, I don't know, but one hears things in Washington, very aggressive intelligence gathering operations on Chinese soil and in Chinese airspace, particularly with regard to stuff like what they call MASINT, Measurement and Signature Intelligence, which is an office run under DIA, which is concerned with picking up electromagnetic signals and chemical signatures in the air, particularly related to nuclear programs and industrial processes. MASINT is a big deal. You've got to get in close to do it, so the US has sniffers all over the world sniffing the air for certain chemicals that are important signatures that tell you all kinds of important stuff, particularly when people are making nuclear weapons, that kind of stuff. So US intelligence efforts against China are enormous, pronounced, aggressive, persistent, and very intrusive. And China hates it, PRC hates it, and they've been looking for ways of pushing back against close-in reconnaissance for a long time. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if their balloon program is a part of that response. I don't know that, but maybe that's some way of thinking about it.
Great, thanks. Katie, you don't need to tell me about balloons, but can you think about how this story might play out in Russia? And also, for me, it was like also a kind of, there's a deja vu, right? There were spies, spy planes, these kinds of issues were once the kind of story we expected in the Cold War story of the US and Russia competition. So anything strike you about this?
Yeah, so what occurs to me about it, and I'm going to try in a very ham-fisted way to segue this back to the theme of the conference from balloons, is that it strikes me looking at the coverage, it's sort of being understood through power and who is powerful, and whether China, by sending this balloon into US airspace, is trying to humiliate the US. The criticism is less that China was spying on the US. I think it's sort of disingenuous to have a kind of shocked, China is spying on the US as the US is spying on China reaction to it. I think a lot of the critique focused on China felt it was able to send this balloon all the way over continental US. And the critique of the Biden administration is that it allowed this to happen, that it demonstrated weakness in the face of a Chinese threat. And I think that's what's so potentially pernicious and damaging about the response we've seen to this and the sort of trajectory that US-China relations are on is evidenced by the shooting down of the second object, which we still don't know what it is, beyond it seems to be roughly cylindrical, possibly grayish, and that it's now in a million small pieces over the sea ice of Alaska, is that this sort of domestic political imperative to be seen to be taking a tough stance, to be demonstrating strength, to be sending an unequivocal message to whoever balloon or drone or whatever this is, overrides what was potentially actually quite a valuable intelligence gathering opportunity. If the object had been allowed to continue for longer, perhaps more could have been learned about it. So the sort of imperative to demonstrate strength is sometimes in tension with what is actually in the interests of national security. But I think you see that on both sides, in both the US and both China. The sort of reflex has gone to sort of robust, demonstrating that strength, demonstrating the absence of weakness, even when that's not necessarily in national interests.
Great, well, let's finish up this before we go, then I want to have everybody possibilities for any kind of comments to add on to that, Will, and then Judy, yeah.
Yeah, I do have one thought about that. I mean, it's what, for me, I mean, I still have a lot of questions about what we just witnessed and what this was, and we're going to learn more, I'm sure, over time. But for me, one of the things that it immediately revealed is just what an enormous consensus there is against China within the United States. I mean, on Thursday, the House voted 419 to 0 to condemn China for this brazen interference in US sovereignty. I mean, you have to, you're like, well, that's an easy vote. No, think who's in Congress. Like, dwell on that for a moment and imagine a vote that is 419 to 0 on anything. I cannot come up with anything. We know that, votes on Russia and Ukraine are contentious. So that's an incredible thing to me to witness. And, since the first incident, which is only what, 10 days, 2 weeks ago, since the balloon became part of our life, there have been 17 bills introduced in the House to counter China. I mean, so now we're talking about a body that is historically unproductive on this question, on this issue. These are sort of, this is a sort of an astounding thing. And then when you think about it more broadly, to think how far we've traveled from maybe 15 or 20 years ago, when the vast majority, the strong majority in both parties would have been a pro-engagement approach to China, that if you were anti-China at that time, you were probably anti-free trade, you were very concerned about human rights, and you were considered a crank. That's really the truth, is that they were a minority within the political system. And now the world is completely upside down in that respect, and there is such a strong consensus that I think, to Katie's point, can potentially bar our ability to intelligently analyze these problems and crises as they concern. And it is deeply alarming that if you can get this worked up over a balloon, what might be your response to something much bigger or kinetic or involving Taiwan, or just let your mind happen for a moment. So yes, that's what the balloon taught me.
Judy?
Is this on? Is this on?
This is on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
As someone who studies Asian American history, I'm concerned mostly about global affairs and the way it impacts racialized minorities in the United States. And so I think it's become very graphically illustrated during the COVID-19 period, with the virus being labeled a China hot virus or Kung flu virus, that when there's moments of international tension, whether it's because of politics, whether because of economic trade, because of war, that has an impact on people here who are racialized and seen as representatives of those countries, regardless of whether they actually are Chinese or not. So there's a fantastic website called Stop AAPI Hate that's been trying to document the incidents of rising hate crimes against Asian Americans. Half of those are directed towards Chinese people, but not everybody who's Chinese or perceived as Chinese are the only targets. I think some things that are very interesting, I think 2/3 of those incidents that are being reported are against women. So you think about the intertwining of racialized and sexualized violence and harm. It's not just some place that's isolated, maybe in the Midwest, but it's also places in California and places like Orange County, which has the 3rd largest AAPI community in the country. There's an increase, according to our Orange County Human Relations Commission, that is perhaps 300 to 400%. These are just documented incidents that people are willing to step forward And so you think about the people who are not willing to step forward, who just experience and just accept these various forms of harm. So I'll just begin with some of those comments.
That's great, and I was thinking of connecting some of these that, you had a spike in the Asian Americans who suffered during that earlier balloon period were people of Japanese descent, and you have this kind of recurrence. With the theme of empire, one of the things that I wanted to get at, though, is the role in which, or the way in which we can, how you think about, so China, Russia, and the United States at different periods have been imperial powers or are imperial powers, but we tended to put them into different pairs at different periods of time. At the moment, I think of China and the United States as a pair, in the sense of being utterly wedded to the idea of not being imperial powers, when when Putin is claiming to be an imperial power. So it's sort of like hidden, well, there's a book, How to Hide an Empire, about the United States, a really wonderful book by Daniel Immerwahr. In some ways, you could think of that if you're reading it through a China-focused lens. There's also a kind of hiding of empire and claiming not to be empire, whereas Russia is straightforward, though obviously a declining empire that's claiming more about being an empire than the others. But also then you can put China and Russia into a pair, because they're the current governments there are legitimated in part, and Katie's book is largely about this, to a narrative about being anti-imperialist. So all of those can be there, and some of these, with both China and the United States, I think about parallels to an empire that hasn't come up yet, and I often think that it's we leave it out and then we left it out, which is the Japanese Empire. Hasn't come up, but the Japanese Empire was an early empire based on the idea that it was not an empire. The Greater East Asia and Crow Prosperity Sphere was saying we are saving places from Western imperialism, but actually we're creating an empire in many of the same ways that I think the People's Republic of China is doing. So I just wondered if we go in kind of reverse order this time and think about what strikes you as sort of parallel. And we can do this the same with all of these, including if we think about parallels between the mistreatment within the People's Republic of China of racialized minorities within it.
I'm not going to directly answer that, John.
That's fine.
Because I really wanted to think about the theme of this conference and the title, Empire Resurgent. And it seems to me that it's more about empire persistent as opposed to empire resurgent. And I wanted to talk about that in two main concepts. And one is really think about the US as a subcolonial imperial power. And it's, I want to begin with my field, because one of my colleagues who studied elite white men said, you focus on the margins, I focus on the center. So I'm going to start with the margins and then think about how the margins can illuminate the center. As I said, I'm in the field of Asian American history, and that very concept of Asian American emerged in the 1960s and 1970s as a critique of US empire and the ways it's connected to racial formation. It was part of a claiming of a third world identification, both with other people of color in the United States, but also with those in decolonizing countries or nations around the world. The US war in Vietnam, in particular, graphically illustrated the violence of US empire. And then since that time period, there's a connection between that particular war with a long century of wars, the United States engagement in Asia. So the US war in the Philippines, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the trade wars with Japan and China, which is very much alive, especially with China in the early 21st century. And I think this understanding of the persistence of US empire and militarism is even more prominent in the emerging fields and very rich fields of Pacific Islander studies and critical refugee studies. So as Yumli Espiritu, who's a scholar at UCSD and one of the founding thinkers of critical refugee studies, she points out the variability of the United States to carry out war in Vietnam depended on having military bases in the Philippines, in Guam, and in San Diego. She's giving us a different understanding of the geography of the US empire by really thinking about how central the Pacific is in these endeavors. And the Pacific Islander Studies scholars have pointed out these military and political occupations are ongoing. They have not dissipated. We have territories today, right, called Guam and American Samoa, that their unequal status is permanently ossified in terms of our political system. And while some locales have achieved a nominal independence, nominal because these compacts of free association still necessitate those locations to depend on the United States for defense, previous relationships of trust territory relationships, for example, actually necessitate an enormous amount of violence. So for example, the bombing of the Marshall Islands, and some scholars have argued that it's the equivalent of one Hiroshima-sized bomb every day for 19 years in those locales. And even statehood in places like Hawaii for Native Hawaiians demonstrate that equal status within the state is not necessarily the ideal solution for those seeking sovereignty as opposed to unequal inclusion. So I think understanding the United States as an empire, a settler colonial as well as a militarized empire, offers a more profound understanding of a nation that challenges the more formulaic understanding of the United States as a nation of immigrants. While Asian Americans can be interpolated into this conception, particularly as model minorities who can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, understanding the imperial basis of the nation takes into account both the continental and overseas expansion across indigenous lands, as well as incorporation of forced and free migration into the country. So going back to the founding of Asian American studies, Asian American history in the late 1960s, the concept of internal colonialism bridged the third world within and the third world without. And acknowledge this feature of empire, which I hope our speakers will speak more about later on today, raises questions about our collective responsibilities in a settler colonial society that has continued to be based on imperial conceptions of nation. So my second set of concepts refers back to my earlier comment about the gender nature of empire. I really appreciated our keynote speaker yesterday, who's thinking about how the intertwining of intimacy of the personal with the imperial, that is not only experienced, empire is not only experienced through structured forms of labor and racial exploitation, but also through gendered forms of intimacy, how empire shapes desire, sexual relationships, marriage formations, and sexual violence. I think about Joanne Nagel's concept of the military sexual complex, Kristen Hoganson's evocation of how masculinity provoked the Spanish-American War, and Stoller's multiple works on the intimacy of empire. That empire is not just a political and economic institution, but a totalizing one that shapes our psyches, our bodies, and our sense of kinship. This is painfully evident through gendered and racialized violence of events like the Atlanta Massacre of 2021, as well as through transnational forms of interracial marriages, abandonments, and adoption. One of the insights of critical refugee studies is to question the boundedness of war, to consider the afterlives of conflict as a continuation. Focusing on intimacy and empire is another way to think about the deep penetration of empire through all facets of life, as well as its persistence in our daily lives. Thanks, Jeff.
Judy, that was wonderful. You answered my question. Absolutely. No, if we think about it this way, you said that the United States, of the three countries we're talking about, is the oldest country. The People's Republic of China is only 70 some odd years. Whatever Putin is governing came into being in 1991. With the United States, the issue is a persistence of empire. Even though the rhetoric of both Russia and China is all about age-old things, they're either trying to recreate something that is imagined as having once been there, or creating something largely from scratch. And you're placing very powerfully where you would put the two there. So anyway, thank you very much.
I was going to talk about Russia, but I'm going to try to morally answer your question or a couple straight thoughts about it. I think that I like your idea or introducing this notion of hidden empire, because I think that up until not that long ago, I think that would be a pretty accurate, I could see that as a subhead in an essay about China, let me put it that way. That has some sort of explanatory power for what the Chinese, what Beijing was projecting in the world. And I think that right now, that's harder to say. I think that if states could talk to each other, I think you could look at China and say, your empire's showing. Because it's really, it's become much more muscular under Xi Jinping than what we've seen before. I mean, when I try to think about attitudes towards China, it's hard because obviously you bring so much of yourself to it. And so like one sort of just metric that I've used over a number of years is to ask other people, particularly China's neighbors, what they think about China. They bring a very different perspective. And in the 1990s and in early aughts, if I was talking to people in Vietnam or Malaysia or Indonesia, they would always say, Jeff, they'd always say, I don't know why you asked me about China. I'm still worried about Japan. And that was very much in people's minds. That was there. And the only thing that you're interested in the United States is this war on terror that your diplomats always come to the region to talk to us about. And the Chinese are talking to us about trade. The Chinese are talking to us about the future. The Chinese are talking to us about opportunity. So I'm worried, but I follow Japan closely, and I'm worried about that. And you only seem to have a singular obsession that says more about yourself than us. I think that conversation's changed a lot now. And now, when you talk to people in Southeast Asia, there is much more concern about China than there was only 10 or 15 years ago. They have seen the negative sides of Belt and Road. South China Sea figures in very prominently. It doesn't so much for many other places in the world, it certainly does there. They've seen trade become a tool for political leverage in a more real way. Of course, they weren't naive, they knew that, but in a very real way. And Chinese diplomats don't talk the way they used to talk. And that's very distinct. So, and as it relates to the United States, if there's any concern, I think it's much more so now, or more often now, a concern for U.S. withdrawal from that part of the world than it is, and its past overweening presence. So, all of which to say it's very fluid, but I think that the historical concern with Japan has maybe receded a little bit as China takes on a very different role in the world at large.
Thanks. Katie?
So one parallel that I see between China and Russia and how they think about, I don't think they would want to use the word empire, I think it would be more great power, is the sense that it's not pejorative, it's not something that they are going out and colonizing a foreign country and bringing it under central control. It's that they're taking back what is rightfully theirs. I think you see that front and center in the rhetoric over Taiwan. And in Putin's case, he gave a speech last June after visiting the Peter the Great exhibition, obviously, in which he explained this very clearly. He talked about people saw Peter the Great waging the Great Northern War for 21 years. On the face of it, they said he was taking something away. He wasn't taking away anything, he was returning. This is how it was. Clearly it fell to us to return and reinforce as well. I think there is this insistence in domestic narratives that this is, right is on the side of this power. This is about taking back, this is about ensuring the dignity of our own citizens, this is about building up our national strength such that we can defend ourselves against these other predatory powers, rather than ourselves engaging in that same behavior. And just one other half parallel that I think you see between the two is in this notion of sovereignty and who is sovereign. In that same speech that Putin gave, he talked about there's no intermediate state, there's no in between. You're either a sovereign or you're a colony. It doesn't matter what we call the colonies, that is how the world works. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that in real time in Ukraine, with this sense that if you're not a great power, if you're not a sovereign nation, you're a colony and you are to be contested and fought over. So I think it condemns countries like Ukraine to be seen as a battleground that Russia is contesting with the West, more specifically with the United States, rather than a country that has its own agency, identity, functioning, very competent military. So I think that's another parallel I would draw between how they both approach that issue and that question.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, to pick up on that, if you look at a map of China today, and I'll defer to real historians here, but if you look at a map of China today, the shape of this nation state, it looks awful like the Qing Empire, right? When the Communist Party came to power in 1949, it initially only controlled quite small bits of eastern China, what were traditionally was known as China proper and Manchuria. And the PRC moved very, very quickly to retake what it saw as retake all the lands that the Qing Empire had controlled, up into Xinjiang, out into Tibet. And it seems to me that part of the PRC project has been to recreate the borders of the Qing Empire. They've got Xinjiang, they've got Tibet, they've got back Macau and Hong Kong, and now they want Taiwan. And you know, is the PRC an imperial project? Is it an empire? Depends who you ask, I guess. Certainly the Chinese Communist Party will tell you it's not, but boy, it sure rhymes with the Qing imperial project, right? I mean, I guess to Judy's point about empire impinging deep into like the personal and the quotidian and into our bodies and our minds. When I hear you talking that way, I just immediately think Xinjiang, and I think, you know, extrajudicial incarceration of people for months and even years, so that they are undergo a coercive program of 思想工作, of thought work, of essentially reprogramming to accept their submission to a dominant culture that is being, an imagined dominant culture that is being imposed upon them. And it feels to me like, you know, the most granular and intrusive incarnation of empire that maybe we see in the world today. And if you ask a Tibetan, you know, they'll say, well, they've been doing that to us for 70 years now. Where have you been? And if you look at other, what they call 少数民族, you know, national minorities in China, they will tell you the same thing, that identity has been kind of hollowed out among, you know, Mongolians, among the Zhuang, the Yi, the Bai, the Miao, all these incredibly various identities and ways of being in the world have been kind of hollowed out and left as sort of decorative husks of identity rather than actual ways of living and ways of doing. And so, I mean, you know, when we think about that aspect of the imperial project, again, it feels to me like the PRC really kind of, you know, rhymes at least with the idea of empire. And then that makes me wonder about, you know, with our balloons and our drones, are we marching towards imperial confrontation between American empire and PRC empire? And you know, we can talk about that more too.
Yeah, I wanted to just pick up on one of the comments Judy made that I think is crucial to think about, which is the gendering and sexualizing of empires. And there's a very interesting when the Republic of China under Nationalist Party rule was invaded by Japan, the most powerful tropes were about a Japanese raping of the country, and this lingers on in the discussions of sexually enslaved comfort women and this debate in the kind of shadow of the Japanese Empire when people argue. Then the war was won, Japan surrendered. The immediate critique of Chiang Kai-shek, which partly led to the Communist Party winning, was that he had just shifted to being a vassal state to the American Empire. And one of the things that got students most enraged was American GIs raping a young Chinese woman in the late 1940s. So there was a kind of carryover of those kinds of images. Flash forward to the present, and there is something called the Milk Tea Alliance, which is a group of Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thai, Burmese activists who see some kind of common connections in their fights against authoritarianism, and also a worry about the kind of Chinese Communist Party's imperial designs. In Japan recently, there was an event, I think very imaginatively put together by a Japanese historian sympathetic to that movement, which had a key figure in the Hong Kong resistance, but they invited an Okinawan resistance leader to talk precisely about these kind of parallels to an American empire in China. So I think one of the really complicated things is to look at these homologies and not fall into a pattern in which we think nothing is any worse than anything else, because some things are worse than other things. And I think, talking about Xinjiang is important, but not at the expense of forgetting about other things that don't fit into the same box, but are very similar, like what's going on in Kashmir. So anyway, this is, I think, the challenge, and it's one of the reasons why I think to have this conference, putting so many different cases together. And I'll just mention one thing about Haiti, to tie it one more, is that when we talk about the global South deserving things, the Chinese Communist Party uses that rhetoric to present itself in the global South as a repressor. At the same time, others would say they're doing exactly what critiques coming from the global South have been saying should be done. But I think we should take questions from the audience, and in the back there, yeah.
So the panel's talked a lot about power over territory, the Marshall Islands and for the United States and Tibet for China. But I have questions because this is called, this panel is called the Three Great Powers and this Battle for Global Hegemony. Is the economic power that China is exercising in Africa, or how it's tying Australia ever closer, and how this economic power is empowering these three large empires to influence more and more of the world, including the global South. And I think, to me, I have so many questions about this, and I wonder if anyone on the panel can answer them.
Great. Who wants to take on that softball?
One thought. I went to Ethiopia a few years ago. We have Howard French in the room, who is obviously the guy who should be talking about China and Africa. But I went to Ethiopia a few years ago to kind of look for China. And of course, China was everywhere in Ethiopia. They were building this terrific mass transit system in Addis Ababa, all Chinese engineers, Chinese workers, Chinese corporations, Chinese financing. They've done 5,000 miles of railway line across Ethiopia. They reconnected Addis Ababa to Djibouti by rail. They have ZTE and Huawei towers absolutely everywhere, industrial zones, you name it. And when I asked Ethiopian people, and particularly Ethiopian sort of security people about this, I was saying, how do you feel that you are giving anything up? Are you losing anything through this process? And the response I got was, the great thing about the Chinese coming here is they do this stuff incredibly quickly, and we don't have to fill out environmental assessment forms. So when the European Union comes to do a project in Ethiopia, we've got to fill out a 126-page environmental impact for everything. It's a hospital, or it's a road, or whatever. This is very difficult for us. We don't have the skills, we don't have the language, we don't have the ways of measuring environmental impact. But the Chinese come, they say, don't worry about the environmental impact, and we'll figure out the financing later. Let's just build it. So they were very receptive to this aggressive economic approach from China. And then at the same time, these guys were saying, but we're also, don't imagine for a minute that we are losing agency here. The minute these guys overstep the line, we know exactly what we're going to do. And a very good example of that was the way that the Chinese merchants and companies, PLC companies, have not been allowed into Ethiopia at the retail level. They are not taking over markets, they're not taking over local economies, that sort of thing. So I think one has to kind of bear in mind that people in African countries have a lot of agency, they're extremely astute, they understand their own interests, and they know very well what the Chinese corporations are after, and they are looking to safeguard their own interests, I think, very effectively, certainly in my sort of, just a thought.
So this one, I think, question will piggyback on that, or no? Yeah, go ahead.
We've been talking so much, our microphones are running out of battery, so you'll just have to talk loudly.
I'll be very quick, and I'm gonna pass on the Africa question.
Good, okay.
I've actually written a lot about this. I just want to pick up on three things that were said that fascinate me, and that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and a little time writing about. And these get back to the debate, mini debate we had last night about whether we should define empire, right? I think that there's some universal things that you said that have nothing to do particularly. The expressions have different colors and things like that, but you scratch beneath the surface, they're universalized. And the three things I have in mind are righteousness. Empire is always self-righteous. Empire always says, it develops arguments about why we deserve what we're doing and why we are, on the one hand, doing good things for the people we're subjugating, that this is a values project that's good for them, and why we're defending our own legitimate self-interest in doing so. Those two things are always together. It's not just one, right? Empires always have 思想工作, which is the Chinese phrase that Adam used, which means mental work, which means in this context, washing the brains about trying to reformat the brains of the people who are being colonized, right? This is universal. There's nothing particular about this in the Chinese instance.
Question of degree, perhaps.
I'm not sure.
And intensity.
I'm not sure. What was Algeria for France? Algeria was a project to turn Algerians into French people. And the French were at this with great violence and enormous energy for over 100 years. This started in the 1830s. This was just, so we as Westerners, because, and I don't mean you, but I think as Westerners, there's a kind of reflex to forget, right? It's so obvious when we see it in other peoples doing these things that it helps us to forget what we have been doing in the same domain, right? And then the final thing is gender. I think that empire almost always, big imperial products always genderize things. And there is, because of patriarchy, the power takes on masculine attributes and feminizes the subject in various ways. And the characteristics of this change in interesting ways from example to example, but I think that template really crosses history and crosses geographies in a very impressive way.
Anybody want to pick up on that?
I would just add one small comment on gendering. We were talking yesterday in the humanities course, not a country that is the focus of this discussion, but about North Korea and the narrative there and the sense of the state, and in particular in this case the Kim family, as the protectors of an innocent, pure, unable to defend itself population. And I think I would add to the sort of list of attributes of empire this, it's I guess connected to righteousness, but this idea of defensiveness, of this idea in China of never forget national humiliation. We are rebuilding our strength now because of how much we suffered in the past. Weakness deserves a beating. I think is originally the Stalin phrase. I think is really prevalent in the legitimation narratives in both China and Russia of if we are weak, if we allow our territory to be taken, if we allow ourselves to be torn apart again, then it's the population that suffers. So empire, or at least national strength, is a form of defending the population and the country. And I think explicitly in the Russian case, you see that argument in territory form because of Russia. The original narrative is the first patriotic war. Napoleon invades from the West in 1812, the Great Patriotic War. Hitler invades from the West in what we know as the Second World War. Now what he's framing as this new patriotic war is again this idea that the territory needs to be controlled as a bulwark, against these outside forces that are attacking the country. So I think there is a sort of domestic narrative around defending the country and strength as a sort of means of protecting the population, rather than in itself, even when in Putin's case he's explicitly waging a war of aggression, framing that as a necessary defensive measure.
I'll just add a fourth characteristic of empire, which was brought up in the previous panel on Haiti about racialized capitalism, that's the fundamental basis for imperial progress.
Question?
So this is so exciting to have such an amazing group of panelists to talk about these issues. So I have, so I'm going to take advantage of this. When we're looking at the comparison, so we've seen a lot of comparisons in the news media as well as in academia, looking at this, China and Taiwan, Russia and Ukraine question. What are the things that, as experts in both of these areas, that you look at and you think these are the things that these comparisons are completely missing, and that I would love to see more elucidation on in especially in news coverage, but also in any kind of academic discourse that we've been reading in these areas. Thank you.
Will, do you want to start?
Well, I think there's a dynamic here that's very different than when I've thought about these things before, which says something a little bit about the way that authoritarianism is changing, is that it's much more personal. There's a turn to a much more personalistic style of rule, and you can see that both in the case of Russia and China. And we said a lot about China, so maybe I'll say something about Russia. I mean, the historical backdrop is critical, and it's astounding to me when we're witnessing events that we have reason to believe that a fair amount of reasonable, rational Russian elites would not want this war. This is contrary to many people's interests, which is to underscore to the degree to which this is a personal project for Vladimir Putin. And it says a lot to the degree to which Russia has changed over the course of the last 23 years. There was an interview conducted by two Russian journalists in 2000 with Vladimir Putin. He'd been in office for only, I want to say 3 months at that point. And it might have been the first and last candid conversation ever captured with Vladimir Putin. At that point, he realized you don't talk to journalists. But I highly recommend it. They took the transcripts, which were a far-ranging conversation, and turned it into a book called First Person, which is fantastic. And in it, Putin talks about his time in the 1980s being a KGB officer in Dresden, and how, to go back to our conversation from yesterday, thinking about surveillance, how totally shocked he was, how repressive East German state was as a KGB officer stationed in East Germany. And he said it was totally invasive. And he said, and this is Putin in 2000 saying, a system built on walls cannot stand. And you think about how much has changed from his vision of how he thought he could rule, would rule. I wrote about this in my book in terms of the period of time that you see from, say, 2002 up until maybe 2010, roughly, where it was an attempt to create a facsimile of a democratic system. How much that has been abandoned now in pursuit of a nostalgia for empire. We now see, and for me personally, the dividing line was really 2011, the protests of Russia without Putin, and the way that the Ukrainian people came out in such a strong way in Maidan to express their own personal preferences. It is personal for Putin because he knows that it was on December 1st, 1991, that the Ukrainian people voted overwhelmingly. 92% of the 84% that voted, 84% of the country voted, 92% said clearly they wanted an independent Ukraine. So strongly that no other part of the Soviet Union held a vote. That was dispositive. It was dispositive. It was like, okay, that's it. That's the verdict. Gorbachev was shocked, and the country fell. And for Putin, he knows that story. And he is willing, as we've seen, I've talked to others in the last 2 days, it's just stunning across this, whereas we approach the 1-year anniversary of this phase of the war. what he's willing to risk, what he's willing to give up, what he is willing to put his people and others through in order to restore. I think it was Brzezinski who said that without Ukraine, Russia is not an empire, but with Ukraine suborned and subordinated, it is an empire. That's leading Putin's actions today, and what we'll see in the year come.
I would just add briefly to that in terms of the mistakes I have personally been guilty of making, and I think we perhaps continue to make, is failing to understand the motives, the motivations of the leaders of these states. And to touch on the point about economic power, the limits of economic power itself as a desirable goal. I think one of the sort of analytical failures in the run-up to the invasion last February, which I was personally guilty of, was assuming that Putin would put much greater value than he has on the stability of the Russian economy. I saw that as being a meaningful part of his legacy, that he was the guy who'd taken the chaos, the disarray of the 1990s and brought back stability. He was the man who made sure the pensions and the salaries were paid on time. And I didn't understand the extent to which he would be prepared to risk all of that in pursuit of these other national goals. So I think that's one lesson to take from Russia's actions, and to perhaps not lull ourselves into quite such a sense of security that economic power, economic prosperity in itself is the end goal. When I think particularly when we're thinking about empire, great power, legacy, and the sort of gendered great man role in that is the extent to which personal interests, personal ambition, and the sense that I think for Xi and for Putin, and certainly for leaders too, there is this sense of what will my legacy be? What is my place in history? And even though it might seem quite irrational and quite illogical, Putin has demonstrated that that doesn't necessarily prevent them from acting.
I just wanted to comment about Taiwan. There's now a growing field on Taiwanese studies, and it just illuminates how dangerous sovereignty is to imperial ambitions. So we think about Taiwan as a pawn between China, United States, other world powers, but can we imagine Taiwan having a movement to claim its sovereignty so that it has its own independent identity? And I think Taiwan's not isolated. It's thinking about all these different other Pacific islands that I mentioned, right? Guam is the westernmost outpost of the United States. I think a third to a half of the land is militarized, directly controlled by the US military, right? So what if Guam wanted to become independent? What would be at stake? What would the United States allow that to happen? And I think this refers back to the conversations about Haiti. And also just really reorienting the way we think about our world geography. Right? We often center on the continents, but what about the islands and the oceans, right? That allow these continents to become global powers.
Just to pick up on that, I think that's a really great point. And if we look at what the PRC is doing in the Solomon Islands right now, new Security Pact just signed, the Solomon Islands were peeled off from recognizing Taiwan in 2019. They changed their recognition to PRC. And the new Security Pact with China has got very vague language in it, which I think probably allows all sorts of possibilities for the PRC military to make use of the Solomon Islands in the future. Why do we care about the Solomon Islands? Because even while empire shapeshifts, strategic geography kind of doesn't, it stays the same. The Solomon Islands were the first islands that the United States invaded, Guadalcanal, as it pushed back against Japanese empire in World War II. It is crucial to control those islands in the second island chain in order to maintain air superiority in the Western Pacific. So you're seeing these echoes of previous imperial conflicts replaying, reproducing themselves all over again with the island chain discourse and strategic competition advantage throughout the Pacific. I think that's really important to understand about that. Yeah.
There are two more quick questions, back in the far back and then over.
Can I just add one final, sorry, to be a hog. Just to be
We started late, we've got a couple minutes.
Just to be clear that this is not limited to autocracies. I don't want to let democratic systems off the hook. Adam and I are both British, and the UK right now is in the throes of a very live political argument about what it means to be a great power in the world. And that is the platform on which Boris Johnson particularly has drawn, on this sense that we can recover our great power. We can be global Britain again. We can be a great power in the world. And that that affects individual political decisions in our own leadership too. No British Prime Minister wants to be the one who presided over the end of the Union. That has real implications for thinking about whether or not to facilitate another independence referendum in Scotland. So I think that tendency to think about power and to think about legacy, is across political systems and not confined to autocracies.
And the UK continues to possess post-imperial possessions. It calls them crown territories and dependencies, which themselves are a network of secrecy jurisdictions that perhaps provide one of the central arteries of sort of cosmopolitan kind of imperial power by allowing trillions and trillions of dollars of capital to be booked offshore. And this is a central part of the UK role in the world today, is being the money guy for what I think we can talk about as imperial power.
In the far back? Yeah.
Yes, very, very succinct, but it goes back to comments by Judy and Will that are very much connected. So in my field, this whole concept of encirclement, as you mentioned the word, but very much studied throughout history in terms of using the term to consolidate domestic support for employment, which ties in with avoiding velvet revolutions. Oh, the threat is all external, right? We shouldn't be having a velvet revolution. The problem with building this encirclement argument in Russia, Nazi Germany, China, and so on and so forth, is that some people, even to this day, buy into it. So, for instance, NATO is to blame for Putin's actions. And that's a terrible mistake, because if you follow the thread, some of which was discussed, Dresden and so on and so forth, it is so much unrelated to NATO. The EU membership, maybe, but this idea of encirclement is extremely dangerous, both internally and externally.
Thank you very much. And one last question, and then we'll have final brief thoughts. And then, because I don't want to get in the way of your lunch, but it's almost, we did start late, so. Yeah.
Thank you. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that actually ties a little bit to the last question as well. I was trying to distinguish between all these empires that we're talking about, those both in the present and in the past. And I'm wondering if the panel could try to do that. That is, that we're talking about some empires, such as the Russian or the Chinese, that perceive themselves as being defensive empires, actually anti-imperial empires. What Jeff was saying about Japan, and what could be said about Imperial Germany in the late 19th century, that is that you are responding to a danger, also to encirclement in that sense. Whereas you have empires such as the British Empire, the French Empire, the current American Empire, they don't see themselves really as defensive. And in that sense, not in that posture of having to explain to the population what they're really about. They are acting naturally in that sense. So that these are two different types of imperial creatures. The second one, the Russian and the Chinese, are also preoccupied with a sense of disaster. That is, that they're now trying to reconstitute something that was taken away from them. And I don't think that we see that, say, with the French Empire or with the British Empire. They were not trying to take back. They were taking by right what they believed belonged to them. But they're not in a sense of, there was a disaster, China had been taken over by all these great powers. If we do something wrong, then the warlords are going to come back. Russia is defending itself because it was taken over and over again. So can you think that these are two different types of empires that when we think of them as the same type, we're actually getting it wrong?
I just have one comment which I've been dying to make here, and it fits with this because I think it's one of the biggest things that's been left out of the story of why the Chinese Communist Party and Putin are in parallel or at least in some sync with Ukraine. If you ask somebody in many people in China right now, what's the first thing you think of when you think of NATO? They will say something that most Americans have totally forgotten. They'll think of the bombs that hit Belgrade in 1999 that killed several Chinese, including a woman who was shown over and over, the daughter of a father shown crying over his daughter. There were references to Clinton as a rapist. There were all of the rhetoric of wounded national pride. It's something that is a footnote in American imagination and is giant in a Chinese imagination. It has to do with this notion of encirclement, which can seem strange, or of NATO causing this, which is something that I think the fact that the narratives you were describing are so similar means that any story you tell about a current issue gets fed very differently depending on which kind of empire you've been schooled in. Right? Comments? Response? Yeah, Judy? And these will be the last questions and then comments, and then I will tell you how to get lunch, but you have to listen to know where.
I am very hungry. But before I comment, I just want to thank the staff of the UCI Humanities Center who are taking their Saturday to be here to support us. So thank you so much for all your support. I think the United States thinks of itself as a defensive empire, right? It defined itself as a independence project against British imperialism. It was trying to carve out its nation state in response to the Russian, the French, the Spanish empires. And certainly, you think about the racialized debates that are happening now, there's such a sense of white defensiveness that they are trying to reclaim their proper rights in attacking Black Lives Matter, attacking other people who are saying that we have a role in this society. So I don't see the difference between that sense of righteousness that was discussed earlier.
I was going to add to what Jeff's excellent point on NATO and Belgrade and that resonance. I mean, we saw that explicitly in the foreign ministry response to the invasion of Ukraine last February. I think the day after the invasion, Hua Chunying was giving the briefing, and she was asked about China's position on this, and she talked about NATO being at fault and NATO owing the Chinese people a debt of blood. So that encirclement narrative, I think, is very front and centered, and is very pernicious. It's also contradictory. It always strikes me looking at the stories these governments tell, is there is this real tension between, on the one hand, being these great, the phrasing that Putin uses about Russia, of Russia is a victorious power. It has always been a great power, and it will always be a great power. On the other hand, it is constantly under existential threat. It could collapse at any moment. The enemies are at the gates. So these stories are innately contradictory, but they're quite effective. And I think watching the slightly hysterical response, to bring us back to the balloon, here in the United States over the past week, you see the weakness and the risk of buying into those sorts of narratives when we start to view the world through that prism of we must devote all of our national resources to competition with China, we must shoot down any object approaching American airspace. It doesn't tackle any of the very real domestic problems a country is dealing with to divert your attention to the enemies at the gates. But it's a very effective method for preserving the status quo. It's very effective tool for political leaders. So I guess it's the opposite of an optimistic note to end on. It does at least get us back to the balloon.
Yeah, I think the idea of the United States as a defense power is interesting. I think there's something that's and this is very inchoate, so forgive me, but I think there's something very different about where we are right now. And part of it, going back to the balloon and what I was saying at the outset about sort of the way that political power in the US views China differently now. There were a lot of things that for quite some time, a lot of ink was spilled, a lot of voices were raised about how the world was going to change, and it hasn't panned out. I mean, there was an idea 20 years ago that if you trade with them, and them being, let's just say, authoritarian powers, that was going to change them. What we needed was time. We needed time for the internet to expose them to other ideas. We needed time for them to come to our universities, send their children, imbibe our values, and then go back, and that will change them. We needed to have the right policies to lift up the reformist that was surely in their midst. And then we get evidence coming back suggesting that it wasn't really working out, and our answer was, well, what we need is more time. And I think that where we are now, where you see the developments in China for what they are, you see spasms of war being waged by Russia, it's hard to say that if only we had a little bit more time, that would change. So I think there's a reckoning to some degree that's going on in this moment, and it's led to confusion about what we did wrong. Did we ever have an agency at all? Was that the delusion? But what comes next?
Adam, are you comfortable with ending there?
Yes.
Great. I was just gonna say, in today's Financial Times, avoiding catastrophe will be the true test of fractious US-China relations, is this article. It says Washington and Beijing must each control their distinct pathologies if they're to get by. So I thought that controlling our distinct pathologies might be a good way to end it. But food is, more importantly, go out there and then there's a glass area, just walk straight that way and you will get your free lunches. And there's lunch for everybody.
Yeah. So go